Rain slashed against the concrete of downtown Seattle, freezing everything it touched. Dalls was a desperate father clinging to a minimum-wage security job to keep his sick daughter alive. When he broke protocol to protect a shivering, mud-soaked vagrant from a violent street gang, he expected to be fired, evicted, and ruined. He spent his last $5 buying her a coffee. He never could have guessed that by sunrise, this ragged woman would step out of a customized Maybach, handing him a contract that would rewrite his entire destiny. The biting November wind howled off Elliott Bay, cutting through the towering skyscrapers of downtown Seattle like a rusted blade. At the base of the towering Orion Ascendant building, a 70-story monument to corporate greed and glass, stood Dalls Reynolds. He was 34, ex-infantry, and currently wearing a cheap, ill-fitting uniform provided by ironclad security solutions. Dalls rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to generate even a fraction of body heat. The digital clock on his bulky radio read 2:14 a.m. 4 more hours. 4 more hours of standing on the frozen pavement, guarding the perimeter of a building owned by billionaires who didn't even know his name. His phone buzzed in his breast pocket, vibrating against his ribs. He unzipped his jacket with stiff fingers and checked the screen. It was an automated text from Seattle Children's Hospital. Reminder: past due balance of $14,500 for Lily Reynolds' pediatric cardiology treatments. Please contact billing to avoid service interruption. Dalls closed his eyes, the neon reflection of a nearby Starbucks washing over his exhausted face. Lily was only 6. She had his hazel eyes and her late mother's stubborn chin, but she had been born with a congenital heart defect that made every day a ticking clock. Since his wife, Sarah, had passed away in a car accident 3 years ago, Dalls had been drowning. He had taken the night shift because it paid a differential of $2 an hour, allowing him to be awake during the day to take Lily to her appointments. But the math never worked. Rent in King County was skyrocketing, groceries were a luxury, and the medical bills were an avalanche, burying them alive. "Reynolds, report." The sharp, nasal voice of his supervisor, Ryder, crackled over the radio on his shoulder. Dalls pressed the transmit button. "Sector 4 is clear, boss. Just wind and rain." "Keep your eyes open," Ryder snapped. "The board of directors is having an emergency summit tomorrow at 8 a.m. The new CEO of the parent company, Vanguard Holdings, is supposed to make her first public appearance. We want the perimeter spotless. No transients, no loiterers. If you see anyone sleeping on the grates, you run them off. Understood?" "Understood," Dalls replied, his voice flat. He hated that part of the job. He knew how close he was to being on the streets himself. One missed paycheck, one unexpected hospital stay for Lily, and he would be the one sleeping on a steam grate, praying the city didn't sweep him away. He resumed his patrol, his heavy tactical boots crunching against the icy sidewalk. The Orion Ascendant building occupied an entire city block, its rear facing a dark, narrow alleyway used for commercial deliveries and waste management. It was a notorious blind spot, shielded from the streetlights and the heavy surveillance of the main plaza. As Dalls rounded the corner into the alley, the smell of rotting garbage and stale beer hit him. He clicked on his heavy-duty mag light, sweeping the beam across the damp brick walls. That was when he heard it. A sharp gasp. The sound of fabric tearing, then a low, cruel laugh. Dalls's military instincts kicked in instantly. His exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging himself into the shadows, and moved silently down the alley. Near the commercial dumpsters, illuminated only by the faint yellow glow of a distant security lamp, 3 men had cornered a figure on the ground. The men were rough-looking, smelling heavily of cheap whiskey and damp denim. One of them, a hulking man with a shaved head and a teardrop tattoo, was kicking at the huddled figure. "Come on, lady," The bald man sneered, his voice slurred. "You got a nice coat under that filth. Hand it over, and whatever is in that bag." The figure on the ground was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her face hidden beneath the hood of a soiled, oversized canvas jacket. She clutched a dirty canvas tote bag to her chest, with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "Leave me alone," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, shaking with cold, but there was a strange, undeniable edge of defiance in it. "I don't think you're in a position to give orders," the second man laughed, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The blade caught the dim light, gleaming dangerously. "Take the bag, Tommy. If she bites, I'll cut her." Dalls didn't hesitate. Ironclad security protocols dictated that guards were strictly observe and report. They were not insured for physical altercations off company property, and stepping off the Orion building's curb meant he was officially out of his jurisdiction. Ryder's voice echoed in his head. "No heroics, Reynolds. You fight, you're fired." But Dalls was a father. He was a soldier, and he couldn't stand by while a woman was gutted in a freezing alley. "Step away from her!" Dalls's voice boomed like a cannon shot down the narrow alley, deep and authoritative. The three men spun around. Dalls stepped into the light, his hand resting on the heavy canister of pepper spray on his belt, his posture rigid and commanding. "Rent a cop," the man with the knife sneered, taking a step forward. "This ain't your building, man. Go back to the front door before you get hurt." "I won't tell you again," Dalls said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and dangerous. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He just unclipped the mag light, holding the heavy metal cylinder at his shoulder. "Drop the knife. Walk. The police are already on their way." It was a bluff, but delivered with absolute conviction. The three men exchanged glances. The bald man spat on the ground. "Ain't worth it. She ain't got nothing but trash anyway." With a few more muttered curses, the trio backed away, shuffling quickly down the far end of the alley and disappearing into the Seattle night. Dalls didn't relax until they were completely out of sight. He exhaled a long breath, a cloud of white vapor in the freezing air, and turned his attention to the woman. She was still on the ground, leaning against the cold brick. She was a mess of tangled, dark hair and mud-stained clothes. Her hands, devoid of gloves, were blue from the cold. "Ma'am?" Dalls approached slowly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay? Did they cut you?" She didn't look up immediately. She kept her head down, her breathing shallow. I'm unharmed," she managed to say, her teeth chattering violently. "You can't stay here," Dalls said gently. "It's 28 degrees out. You're going to freeze to death before the sun comes up." "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. Dalls looked back toward the gleaming glass of the Orion building. His shift wasn't over until 6 a.m. If he brought her inside, it was a direct violation of company policy. Immediate termination. But looking at her shaking frame, he saw the same vulnerability he saw in Lily when she was hooked up to the monitors at the hospital. "Come on," Dalls said, making his decision. He reached out a strong, calloused hand. The woman hesitated. She looked at his hand, then slowly tilted her head up. For a second, Dalls was caught off guard. Beneath the grime, the soot, and the matted hair, her features were strikingly sharp. High cheekbones, piercing, intelligent gray eyes, and a jawline that suggested a fierce stubbornness. She didn't look like someone broken by the streets. She looked like someone surviving a war. She took his hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite the cold. Dalls pulled her up, steadying her when she stumbled. He led her to the rear loading dock of the Orion building. It was sheltered from the wind and had a large industrial heating vent that blew warm air into the concrete bay. It was strictly off-limits to unauthorized personnel, but Dalls knew the cameras here were blind spots. They had been broken for weeks, a maintenance issue the wealthy building management never bothered to fix. He sat her down on a stack of wooden pallets near the vent. "Stay here," he ordered softly. Dalls jogged to his security podium around the corner. He grabbed his thermos, a battered silver thing, and his lunchbox. He returned to the loading dock and handed her the thermos. "It's black coffee. Drink it slowly," he said. He unzipped his heavy uniform coat, revealing only a thin, long-sleeve shirt underneath, and draped the thick jacket over her shoulders. The woman looked up at him, her gray eyes widening slightly. "You'll freeze." "I've survived worse," Dalls said, forcing a smile. He opened his lunchbox and pulled out a foil-wrapped package. "Egg and cheese sandwich. Made it this afternoon. It's cold now, but it's calories." She took the sandwich, her hands trembling as she unwrapped it. She took a small, hesitant bite, and then, as if realizing how starved she was, she ate it ravenously. Dalls sat a few feet away, crossing his arms to preserve his body heat, watching the perimeter for his supervisor. "Why are you doing this?" the woman asked, her voice clearer now, the warmth returning to her cheeks. "Your supervisor, Ryder, was it? He said to run off the transients." Dalls froze. "You heard my radio?" She took a sip of the hot coffee. "I hear a lot of things. I've been sleeping near the vents for 2 days. I hear the guards complain. I hear the executives talking when they come down to the smoking area. You have a daughter, Lily." Dalls felt a sudden spike of defensiveness, a father's protective instinct. "You shouldn't listen in on private conversations." "When you are invisible, people say everything in front of you," she said quietly. She looked at the heavy coat draped over her. "You need this job to pay for her cardiology treatments, yet you are risking it for a stranger in an alley. That is illogical." "Maybe," Dalls said, looking out into the rain. "But if I lose my humanity to keep a job, I'm not the kind of father Lily needs anyway. I can always find another minimum wage gig. I can't find another conscience." The woman stared at him. It wasn't the vacant, desperate stare of someone lost to the streets. It was an analytical, piercing gaze. It felt as though she were reading his very soul, calculating his worth. "You work for Ironclad," she noted, looking at the patch on the jacket. "What do you think of the security protocols here?" Dalls chuckled bitterly. "Why? You planning a heist?" "Just making conversation to stay awake." Dalls sighed. "The security here is a joke. It's all theater. They pay us $12 an hour and expect us to guard $1 billion worth of corporate secrets. The cameras in the West Wing have been down for a month. The biometric scanners on the executive elevators can be bypassed with a simple thermal spoof. And the board members? They leave their laptops unlocked in the VIP lounge like they own the world. It's negligent." "Interesting," the woman murmured. She pulled a small, worn leather notebook from her dirty canvas bag and a stub of a pencil. She jotted something down. "You a writer?" Dalls asked, amused. "Something like that," she said. She closed the book. "Tell me about Lily." For the next 3 hours, they sat in the dim light of the loading dock. Dalls, freezing but fueled by the rare chance to just talk to someone, poured his heart out. He told her about Lily's love for astronomy, about the medical debt crushing him, about the eviction notice sitting on his kitchen counter. He didn't know why he was telling a homeless woman all this, but there was something incredibly commanding about her presence. She didn't offer empty pity. She just listened, her gray eyes locked onto his, absorbing every detail. At 5:45 a.m., the sky began to turn a bruised, stormy purple. The city was waking up. Dalls stood, stretching his stiff legs. "I need to get back to the front desk. My relief is going to be here in 15 minutes, and the executives are arriving early today for some big summit." He turned back to the pallets. "You can keep the coat for today, just..." He stopped. The pallets were empty. The woman was gone. Left sitting perfectly centered on the wooden slats was his heavy ironclad jacket, neatly folded. On top of it sat his empty silver thermos. Dalls blinked, looking around the alley. There was no sign of her. She had vanished like a ghost in the morning mist. A strange sense of disappointment washed over him, but he shook it off. He put his jacket back on, feeling the lingering warmth she had left behind, and hurried back to his post. At 6:15 a.m., the lobby of the Orion Ascendant building was a beehive of high-stakes anxiety. Janitors were frantically polishing the marble floors. Security personnel were running sweeps. Dalls stood by the front desk, waiting for his supervisor to sign his timesheet so he could go home to Lily. His body ached, and his head pounded from sleep deprivation. "Reynolds!" Dalls turned to see Ryder storming across the lobby. The supervisor's face was red, a vein bulging in his forehead. He didn't look happy. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Dalls?" Ryder spat, stopping inches from Dalls's face. "Excuse me?" Ryder slammed a tablet onto the reception desk. "The camera's on the main street. I reviewed the footage from 2 a.m. You left your designated patrol zone. You went off property into the alley, and worse, Camera 4 caught you leading a vagrant into the loading dock." Dalls's stomach plummeted. He had forgotten about the street-facing cameras catching the edge of the alley. "Ryder, listen, she was being attacked." "I don't care if she was being crucified," Ryder roared, drawing the attention of a few early-arriving executives. "You abandoned your post. On the day the new CEO of Vanguard Holdings is arriving, you brought a biohazard into a secure zone. You are done, Reynolds. Terminated. Hand over your badge and your radio right now." Dalls felt the blood drain from his face. Terminated. The word echoed in his skull. The $14,500 hospital bill, the eviction notice, his medical insurance for Lily, tied to this very job, gone. "Ryder, please," Dalls said, his voice cracking, swallowing his pride for his daughter. "Suspend me. Dock my pay. But I need this job. My daughter—" "Your daughter is not my problem," Ryder sneered, ripping the radio from Dalls's shoulder. "Get out of my building before I have you arrested for trespassing." Dalls stood frozen. The world felt like it was collapsing. He slowly reached up and unclipped his badge. He set it on the marble counter. It was over. He had tried to be a good man, and it had cost him everything. Suddenly, a massive commotion erupted outside the glass doors. A motorcade of 4 jet-black Cadillac Escalades and 1 sleek, bulletproof Maybach pulled up to the curb. Seattle police motorcycles, lights flashing, flanked the vehicles. The heavy glass doors of the lobby were pulled open by men in sharp black suits with earpieces. "Stand to! Form up!" Ryder yelled at the remaining guards, instantly forgetting Dalls. "The Vanguard CEO is here! Look sharp!" The executives in the lobby scrambled into a welcoming line. Everyone held their breath. The door of the Maybach opened. First stepped out a pair of Christian Louboutin heels. Then, a woman emerged. She was flanked by heavily armed private security. She wore a tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford power suit that probably cost more than Dalls made in 3 years. Her dark hair was blown out perfectly, falling over her shoulders. Her posture was immaculate, radiating absolute authority and terrifying power. But as she took off her designer sunglasses, revealing piercing, intelligent gray eyes, Dalls's heart stopped. It was her. The dirt was gone. The bruises had been covered with flawless makeup. But the sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, the fierce presence, it was the homeless woman from the alley. Her name was Vergie Phillips. She was the 32-year-old billionaire heiress and newly appointed CEO of Vanguard Holdings. And she had spent the last 3 days disguised on the streets of her own city. The lobby fell dead silent as Vergie walked through the doors. The board members bowed their heads slightly. Ryder puffed out his chest, saluting stiffly. Ms. Phillips, Ryder said, his voice trembling with sycophantic joy. Welcome to Orion. Ironclad Security is honored to secure the premises for you. Vergie didn't even look at him. She stopped in the middle of the lobby. Her cold gray eyes scanned the room, bypassing the wealthy executives, bypassing the polished marble until they locked onto Dalls, who was standing by the desk, looking like he had just seen a ghost. Vergie bypassed the welcoming committee and walked straight toward the security desk. The entire lobby watched in stunned silence. She stopped in front of Dalls. She looked at his badge sitting on the counter. Then, she looked at Ryder. Who authorized the termination of this man? Vergie asked. Her voice was no longer raspy and shivering. It was smooth, commanding, and cold as ice. Ryder stepped forward, sweating profusely. I did, Miss Phillips. He broke protocol. He abandoned his post last night to fraternize with a homeless person in the alley. I was just ensuring your building is kept pristine. Vergie slowly turned her head to look at Ryder. That homeless person was me. The color drained from Ryder's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Ma'am, for the past 3 days, I have been conducting a covert audit of my company's ground-level infrastructure, Vergie said, her voice projecting across the silent lobby, making the board members flinch. I found a board of directors that leaves classified data unsecured. I found cameras that have been broken for a month. I found a security supervisor who cowers in his office. She took a step closer to Ryder, her eyes flashing dangerously. And I found 3 men in the alley who were prepared to stab me to death to steal my bag. A bag that contained the flash drive with the financial irregularities of half the executives in this room. The board members gasped. I would have bled out on the concrete, Vergie continued, if this man, she gestured to Dalls, had not risked his life and his job to save a woman he believed was absolutely nothing to him. He then gave me his food, his coat, and his humanity. She looked at Ryder in disgust. You are fired. Pack your desk. If I see you in this building in 10 minutes, I'll have you thrown through the glass. Ryder practically sprinted towards the elevators in terror. Vergie turned back to Dalls. The coldness in her eyes melted away, replaced by the same genuine warmth he had seen in the loading dock. Dalls, she said softly, using his name. Ms. Phillips, Dalls stammered, still in shock. I didn't know. I know you didn't, she smiled slightly. She gestured to a sharply dressed man beside her, who immediately handed her a sleek leather folder. She held it out to Dalls. What is this? Dalls asked. Ironclad Security is losing its contract today. I am dissolving them and bringing my personal security in-house under Vanguard, Vergie said. I need a director of executive protection. Someone who understands real security, not theater. Someone with a moral compass. The starting salary is $250,000 a year, full premium benefits. Dalls stared at the folder. His hands began to shake. I don't know what to say. There's more, Vergie said softly, stepping closer so only he could hear. Vanguard Holdings owns a controlling stake in Seattle Children's Hospital. I've already made a phone call. Lily's balance is cleared, and she's being moved to the VIP cardiology wing this morning for the best treatment in the state. Dalls's knees buckled slightly. Tears, hot and heavy, sprang to his eyes. He covered his mouth, the weight of the last 3 years of terror, poverty, and fear crashing down and dissolving all at once. He had been preparing to lose everything, and instead, he had just been handed the world. Why? Dalls choked out, wiping his eyes. Vergie Phillips reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. Because in a city full of billionaires, you were the only one who realized I was freezing. Now take the contract, Dalls. Go see your daughter. We have a lot of work to do. The scent of antiseptic and stale hospital cafeteria food was something Dalls Callahan had grown brutally accustomed to over the past 3 years. Walking through the double doors of Seattle Children's Hospital usually felt like walking into an interrogation room. a place of stress, ticking clocks, and financial dread. But today, the air felt different. Today, he wasn't heading to the crowded, chaotic general ward. He stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor, a secured area designated for high-profile donors and VIP patients. The chaotic noise of the lower floors was replaced by a serene, hushed quiet. The floors were polished hardwood, the lighting was soft and warm, and a dedicated nursing station sat right outside a set of double oak doors bearing the name Lily Callahan. Dalls took a shaky breath, adjusting the collar of the crisp white dress shirt Vergie's executive assistant had delivered to his apartment just 2 hours prior, along with 3 bespoke charcoal suits. He pushed open the heavy oak door, his breath hitched in his throat. The room looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital room. Massive, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Seattle skyline and the Puget Sound. A comfortable velvet sofa sat in the corner, and a massive flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, currently playing a documentary about the rings of Saturn. In the center of it all, sitting up in a state-of-the-art, fully adjustable medical bed, was his 6-year-old daughter. Lily's pale face was flushed with excitement, her hazel eyes wide as she pointed a small plastic remote at the television. The heavy, intimidating heart monitors were neatly tucked away into custom wall consoles, removing the terrifying mechanical aesthetic that usually surrounded her. "Daddy!" Lily beamed, dropping the remote and reaching her thin arms out. Dalls rushed forward, carefully wrapping his arms around her delicate frame and burying his face in her soft hair. He held her tight, squeezing his eyes shut as the reality of the morning finally set in. He wasn't going to lose her. The insurmountable mountain of debt that had been crushing his lungs for years had simply evaporated into thin air. "Look at this place, sweetheart," Dalls whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you like it?" "It's like a spaceship," she whispered back, her eyes sparkling. "The nurse said I get to order pancakes whenever I want, even for dinner. Is that true?" "If the nurse says it, it must be true," Dalls laughed, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. The door opened behind him, and Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief of pediatric cardiology, stepped in. Dalls tensed out of habit. Dr. Harrison was usually the bearer of bad news regarding stalled treatments and denied insurance claims. But today, the elderly doctor was smiling warmly. "Mr. Callahan," Dr. Harrison said, extending a hand, "I see you found the new accommodations." I don't understand how this happened so fast," Dalls said, shaking the doctor's hand. "When Vanguard Holdings makes a request, the earth tends to move," Dr. Harrison said with a knowing chuckle. "Ms. Phillips's office transferred a sum this morning that not only cleared Lily's past balances, but entirely pre-funded a highly experimental, non-invasive valve replacement surgery. We've already flown the surgical team in from Boston. We operate on Tuesday." Dalls's knees felt weak. He looked at Lily, who was happily watching her documentary, oblivious to the fact that her death sentence had just been commuted. "Thank you, doctor." "Thank you," Dalls managed to say. "Don't thank me. Thank your new employer," Dr. Harrison replied gently. "Now I believe you have a job to get to. Lily is in the best hands on the West Coast. Go to work, Mr. Callahan." Dalls gave Lily one last lingering hug, promising to return the second his shift ended. As he stepped out of the hospital and into the waiting black SUV that Vergie had sent for him, his mind shifted gears. The overwhelming gratitude morphed into a sharp, singular focus. Vergie Phillips had saved his world. Now it was his job to protect hers. He arrived at the Vanguard Holdings tower, a massive monolith of black glass and steel that dwarfed even the Orion building. As he rode the private elevator up to the penthouse executive suite, Dalls opened the encrypted tablet Vergie's assistant had given him. The file on the screen made his blood run cold. Vergie hadn't just been auditing her company's security while posing as a homeless woman. she had been hiding. The data on the flash drive she carried contained undeniable proof that a faction of Vanguard's board of directors, led by a ruthless venture capitalist named William Hastings, had been embezzling billions through offshore shell companies. Worse, the file detailed a sinister twist. The three men in the alley the night before weren't random street thugs looking for a quick score. They were professional contractors. Hastings had found out about Vergie's undercover audit and hired them to retrieve the drive and ensure the new CEO suffered a tragic, fatal mugging before she could ever take power. Dalls's jaw clenched. He was no longer a minimum-wage guard scaring away vandals. He had just walked into a high-stakes corporate war zone, and the woman who saved his daughter was in the crosshairs of ruthless, powerful men. The penthouse level of the Vanguard Tower was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all frosted glass, brushed steel, and minimalist art. As Dalls stepped off the elevator, the atmosphere was thick with palpable tension. He found Vergie in her massive corner office. She was standing by the window, looking out over the city, dressed in a striking crimson blazer that screamed power and authority. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, a genuine smile breaking through her icy corporate facade. The charcoal suit looked significantly better than the ironclad polyester, Vergie noted, her gray eyes sweeping over him with approval. It breathes a lot better, that's for sure, Dalls replied, stepping into the room. His posture was entirely different now. The exhausted, beaten-down father was gone. In his place stood an alert, highly trained infantry veteran. His eyes naturally scanned the room for sight lines, blind spots, and exits. "How is Lily?" she asked softly. She's going to live, Miss Phillips," Dalls said, his voice lowering with immense gravity. "Because of you. I don't know how I will ever repay that debt, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying." Vergie held his gaze for a long moment, the air between them shifting, growing heavy with an unspoken connection. "You don't owe me a debt, Dalls. You saved my life in that alley. We are even. And please, when we are behind closed doors, call me Vergie." She walked over to her massive mahogany desk and sighed, the weight of her empire settling on her shoulders. "I assume you read the brief on the tablet?" "I did," Dalls said, his tone turning strictly professional. "William Hastings. He orchestrated the attack in the alley. He knows you have the flash drive, and he knows you survived." "Exactly," Vergie said, tapping her manicured nails against the desk. "In 20 minutes, I'm walking into the executive boardroom to formally introduce myself as CEO and initiate a hostile restructuring of the board. I am going to publicly gut Hastings and hand the flash drive over to the federal authorities." "A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, Vergie," Dalls warned, stepping closer. "If Hastings knows he's about to go to federal prison for the rest of his life, he won't just sit in that chair and take it. He will try to stop you from making that presentation." "That is why you are here," Vergie said, looking up at him with absolute trust. "Then we change the rules of engagement," Dalls declared. He pulled a small, sleek earpiece from his pocket and secured it in his ear, handing a matching one to her. "I've already remotely locked down the executive floor. No one comes in or out without my biometric approval. But Hastings is already inside the building. He likely brought his own private security detail." "He never travels without them," Vergie confirmed. "2 former mercenaries. Nasty work. I want you to stay exactly 2 steps behind me at all times," Dalls instructed, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If I tell you to move, you move. If I tell you to drop, you drop. Do you understand?" For a moment, Vergie looked taken aback. No one gave her orders. She was a billionaire, a queen on a corporate chessboard. But looking into Dalls's fierce, protective hazel eyes, she felt a strange, thrilling sense of safety. She nodded. "Understood." 20 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the Vanguard boardroom swung open. The room was massive, featuring a 50-foot polished obsidian table surrounded by 20 terrified executives. At the far end of the table sat William Hastings. He was a silver-haired man in his late 50s with a bespoke pinstripe suit and eyes like a dead shark. Standing directly behind Hastings were two massive men in tactical suits, their hands resting suspiciously near the bulges under their jackets. The room fell dead silent as Vergie entered, radiating lethal confidence. Dalls walked half a pace ahead and slightly to her right, his eyes locked onto Hastings' goons. "Good morning, gentlemen," Vergie announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She didn't sit down. She walked to the head of the table and slammed a small, silver flash drive onto the obsidian surface. The sharp clack made several board members flinch. Hastings stared at the drive, his face draining of color, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "I believe we all know what this is," Vergie continued, her icy gaze sweeping the room. "For the past 3 days, I have audited this company from the ground up. I have uncovered gross negligence, catastrophic security failures, and most importantly, an embezzlement ring orchestrated by William Hastings." Chaos erupted. Executives gasped, whispering frantically. "This is an outrage!" Hastings roared, slamming his fists on the table and standing up. "You are an entitled, paranoid little girl playing dress-up. That drive is fabricated garbage, and I will not let you destroy this company." Hastings shot a sharp, desperate look at the two mercenaries behind him. It was a subtle nod, a silent command. Dalls caught the microscopic shift in the mercenary on the left. The man's shoulder dipped, his hand diving inside his jacket for a concealed weapon. Dalls moved with terrifying, explosive speed. Before the mercenary could even clear his weapon from the holster, Dalls vaulted over the corner of the obsidian table, his expensive suit tearing slightly at the shoulder. He collided with the armed man like a freight train, driving his shoulder squarely into the mercenary's chest and slamming him brutally against the glass wall. The gun, a suppressed compact pistol, clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished wood. The second mercenary lunged toward Vergie, but Dalls was already pivoting. Using the momentum from the first takedown, Dalls spun and delivered a devastating, precise elbow strike to the second man's jaw. The sickening crack echoed through the boardroom, and the massive man crumpled to the floor, instantly unconscious. The entire altercation took less than 4 seconds. The boardroom was frozen in absolute, terrified silence. Several executives were cowering under the table. Dalls stood over the groaning mercenaries, straightening his tie with eerie calm. He kicked the suppressed pistol away and locked his cold, furious eyes on William Hastings. "Miss Phillips has the floor," Dalls said softly, his deep voice slicing through the silence like a razor. "I suggest everyone remain seated." Hastings collapsed back into his leather chair, shaking uncontrollably, his assassination plot dismantled in the blink of an eye. Vergie stood perfectly still. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear. She stared at Dalls Callahan, the desperate, freezing single father she had met in an alleyway just hours ago. He stood between her and her enemies, like an impenetrable wall, a modern-day knight in a charcoal suit. She smiled, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her face. "As I was saying," Vergie purred, turning back to the terrified board. "Effective immediately. There are going to be some changes around here." The wail of police sirens pierced the high-altitude silence of the Vanguard Holdings penthouse, echoing off the skyscrapers of downtown Seattle. Down below, a convoy of black FBI Suburbans was aggressively mounting the curb. But inside the boardroom, time seemed to stand completely still. Dalls Callahan remained positioned between the cowering executives and Vergie Phillips. The two mercenaries on the floor groaned, one clutching his shattered jaw, the other slowly coming to his senses only to realize Dalls's heavy leather shoe was pressed firmly against his wrist, pinning his weapon arm to the floor. William Hastings sat in his leather chair, the arrogant, untouchable aura completely stripped from his silver-haired frame. He looked like an old, terrified man. "You didn't really think I would walk into a room full of vipers without bringing a mongoose, did you, William?" Vergie's voice was smooth, laced with venom. She walked over to the windows, looking down at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass streets below. "I tipped off the federal authorities an hour ago. The flash drive is already in the hands of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your offshore accounts have been frozen. Your shell companies are being raided as we speak." "You're making a mistake, Vergie," Hastings hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "Vanguard wasn't built by playing by the rules. It was built in the shadows. Your father knew that. I built this empire while you were away at boarding school. You cut me out, and the whole foundation crumbles." "Then let it crumble," Vergie snapped, spinning around, her gray eyes blazing with an intensity that made the remaining board members shrink in their seats. "I will rebuild it from the ground up, with people who don't hire assassins to silence their problems." The heavy boardroom doors burst open, and a swarm of heavily armed FBI agents flooded the room, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the bespoke suits of the executives. They swarmed Hastings, wrenching him out of his chair and slapping heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. As Hastings was being dragged toward the door, he locked eyes with Dalls. The defeated ventures capitalist's lips curled into a twisted, ugly sneer. "You think you're a hero, Bodyguard? You think you stopped this? Vanguard is a hydra. I have friends who stand to lose billions today. You didn't just paint a target on her back. You painted one on your own." Dalls didn't flinch. He stepped closer to Hastings, towering over the older man, his voice a low, lethal growl. "Let them come. I'll need the exercise." Hastings laughed, a cold, dry sound, before the federal agents shoved him out into the hallway. Within minutes, the boardroom was cleared. The corrupt executives were detained for questioning. The mercenaries were hauled off to holding cells, and the massive obsidian table was left empty, save for the silver flash drive and a few overturned crystal water glasses. The adrenaline that had been surging through Dalls's veins began to recede, leaving behind a dull ache in his shoulder where he had impacted the first mercenary. He let out a long, heavy exhale and rolled his shoulders, wincing slightly as the torn fabric of his expensive charcoal suit pulled against his skin. "Well," Vergie said softly, stepping into his line of sight. "That was remarkably efficient." Dalls looked at her. The icy, commanding CEO had melted away. She looked exhausted, the weight of the morning's coup finally settling on her delicate shoulders. Yet she looked at him with an expression of profound awe. "I'm sorry about the suit," Dalls said, offering a faint, self-deprecating smile. "I don't think my first paycheck is going to cover the damages." Vergie let out a short, breathy laugh, stepping closer to him. She reached out, her cool, manicured fingers gently brushing against the torn fabric on his shoulder. The touch sent an unexpected jolt of electricity down Dalls's spine. "The suit is replaceable, Dalls," she murmured, looking up into his hazel eyes. "What you just did, what you've done for me since last night. I have never met anyone like you." "I was just doing my job, Vergie." "No," she corrected him, her voice firm but tender. "Ironclad guards do their jobs. They observe and report. You intervene. You protect. You put yourself in the line of fire for a woman you thought was sleeping on cardboard. You are a profoundly good man, Dalls Callahan, and those are in incredibly short supply in this building." She pulled her hand back, clearing her throat as the professional boundary threatened to blur. "Go to the hospital. Be with Lily. I will handle the press and the federal agents here. Your shift is over for the day." Dalls nodded, picking up the earpiece he had dropped during the scuffle. "I'll set a perimeter detail of trusted Vanguard security outside your office before I leave. Do not go anywhere without them." "Yes, sir," she smiled softly. "Give Lily my love." Tuesday arrived with the kind of agonizing slowness that only a parent waiting for their child to emerge from surgery can understand. The VIP waiting room at Seattle Children's Hospital was silent, save for the ticking of a modern wall clock. Dalls sat on a plush sofa, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He was wearing a fresh, impeccably tailored navy suit, another gift from Vergie's office, but he felt as ragged and exhausted as he had in the alleyway days ago. Lily had been in the operating room for 6 hours. The experimental valve replacement surgery was highly intricate. Every minute that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing down on Dalls's chest. Suddenly, a warm cup of coffee was pushed into his line of sight. Dalls looked up to see Vergie. She had canceled all her corporate meetings, delegated the fallout of the Hastings scandal to her legal team, and spent the entire morning sitting silently across from Dalls, working on her laptop, but never letting him out of her sight. "Drink," she commanded gently, sitting next to him on the sofa. Dalls took the cup, the warmth seeping into his freezing hands. "You don't have to be here, Vergie. You have a company to rebuild. The company has existed for 60 years. It will survive one Tuesday without me," she replied, not looking up from her screen. "Besides, I promised Lily I would be here when she woke up. I intend to keep that promise." Dalls stared at her, overwhelmed by the sheer force of her compassion. The billionaire CEO was sitting in a hospital waiting room, drinking bad vending machine coffee, just to anchor a single father she had hired 3 days ago. The heavy double doors of the surgical wing finally pushed open. Dr. Harrison emerged, still in his blue scrubs, pulling off his surgical cap. Dalls shot to his feet, his heart hammering in his throat. Vergie stood right beside him, her hand resting instinctively on his lower back. Dr. Harrison smiled, his eyes crinkling behind his glasses. "The surgery was a complete success, Dalls. Her heart responded beautifully to the new valve. Her vitals are stronger than they've ever been. We're moving her to post-op recovery now. She's going to have a long, healthy life." A choked sob escaped Dalls's lips. The invisible mountain of dread he had carried for 3 years instantly vanished. He staggered back a step, overwhelmed, and Vergie caught his arm, steadying him with a beaming, tearful smile of her own. By midnight, the VIP wing was cloaked in darkness. Lily was fast asleep in her luxury room, a soft, steady beep from the monitor confirming her strong, new heartbeat. Vergie had finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on the velvet sofa in the private waiting area outside Lily's room. A cashmere blanket draped over her. Dalls, however, was wide awake. The adrenaline of the day had faded, but the infantry instincts in his blood were on high alert. Hastings' threat still echoed in his mind. You cut off the head, the body still thrashes. Dalls stood by the window in the dimly lit corridor, watching the elevator banks. At 1:15 a.m., the elevator chimed softly. A figure stepped out. It was a man in hospital scrubs, pushing a heavy, rolling sanitation cart. He kept his head down, his face obscured by a surgical mask and a blue bouffant cap. Something instantly felt wrong to Dalls. The VIP floor was cleaned strictly during the day shift. More importantly, the man's posture was too rigid. His strides were measured, calculated, rolling from heel to toe, the silent walk of a predator, not a janitor. And as he pushed the cart, Dalls noticed the man's shoes. They weren't standard hospital clogs. They were black, tactical combat boots with thick rubber soles. Dalls stepped away from the window, melting into the shadows near the entrance of Lily's room. He reached into his jacket, his hand wrapping around the grip of his heavy tactical flashlight. He refused to carry a firearm in a pediatric ward, but he was far from defenseless. The janitor stopped his cart just outside Lily's door. He checked the hallway, ensuring it was empty. Then, he reached into the pocket of his scrubs and pulled out a long, pre-filled medical syringe. The liquid inside was clear. Potassium chloride. A massive dose would cause immediate cardiac arrest, and in a girl recovering from heart surgery, It would look perfectly natural. A tragic complication. The man reached for the door handle to Lily's room. He never made it. A hand, clamped like a steel vise, clamped over the man's mouth, violently jerking his head backward. Before the assassin could even register the attack, Dalls swept the man's legs out from under him. They crashed to the sound-dampened carpet in total silence. Dalls landed squarely on the man's chest, driving his knee mercilessly into the assassin's sternum. The air left the killer's lungs in a violent hiss. The assassin thrashed, driving the needle toward Dalls's neck. Dalls caught the man's wrist with his free hand, twisting it with bone-snapping torque. The assassin grimaced, his fingers opening involuntarily, and the syringe clattered to the floor, rolling harmlessly under the sanitation cart. The killer reached for a concealed blade in his waistband, but Dalls was faster. He brought the heavy metal butt of his maglite down in a short, brutal arc, striking the man directly on the temple. The assassin's eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp on the carpet. Dalls remained on top of him, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying, primal rage. This man had come for his daughter, to hurt Vergie by taking the one thing Dalls loved most. The door to the waiting area creaked open. Vergie stood there, rubbing her eyes, awoken by the faint scuffle. She froze, staring at the unconscious man on the floor, the rolling cart, and the syringe catching the dim emergency lights. She looked up at Dalls, horror dawning on her face. "Hastings." Dalls stood up, dragging the unconscious assassin by the collar of his scrubs and tossing him into an empty supply closet. He locked the door from the outside and turned back to Vergie, his hazel eyes completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a soldier who had just been given a new war. "They tried to touch my daughter," Dalls said, his voice a chilling, deadly whisper. "They brought this into her hospital." Vergie stepped forward, her heart breaking for him, but also recognizing the terrifying shift in his demeanor. "Dalls." "Hastings was right. Cutting off the head isn't enough," Dalls said, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. He looked at Vergie, his jaw locked in iron resolve. "I'm going to find every single person connected to this network, and I'm going to burn them to the ground." The supply closet in the VIP cardiology wing smelled strongly of bleach and sterile cotton. But to the man bound to the heavy metal shelving unit with industrial zip ties, it felt like the walls were closing in. Dalls Callahan stood over the assassin. He held the man's burner phone in one hand and the confiscated syringe of potassium chloride in the other. He didn't yell. He didn't strike the man again. Instead, Dalls leaned in close, his voice a terrifying, perfectly controlled monotone that promised absolute destruction. "You have exactly one opportunity to make a choice," Dalls whispered, his hazel eyes completely dead. "You can tell me who gave you the order and where they are right now. Or I can inject this entire syringe into your neck, walk out of this closet, and let the medical staff assume a drug-seeking trespasser overdosed in a supply room. It will take less than 2 minutes for your heart to explode. Decide." The assassin, a hardened contractor who had operated in global war zones, looked into Dalls's eyes and saw no bluff. He saw a father protecting his child. He swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat dripping down his temple. "Pier 49, the assassin choked out. "The private shipping terminal. Hastings had a contingency plan if the feds raided Vanguard. His top lieutenants, 3 board members and their muscle, are purging the offshore hardware servers onto a private yacht. They are leaving for international waters at 3:04 a.m. Dalls stepped back, slipping the syringe into a biohazard bin. He didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked out, locking the door behind him. Vergie was waiting in the corridor, her arms crossed tight against her chest, a storm raging in her gray eyes. "Pier 49, Dalls said simply. "Hastings' loyalists are making a run for it with the server drives. If they get to international waters, they take the billions they stole and the proof of the assassination order with them. The FBI is still tied up processing the boardroom raid. They won't mobilize a port task force in time. Then we don't wait for them, Vergie said, pulling her phone from her pocket. She dialed a highly encrypted number. Vanguard doesn't just employ boardroom executives, Dalls. We own a private maritime security firm. But they need someone to lead them, someone who knows exactly what to look for. Dalls nodded, rolling up the sleeves of his ruined Navy suit. Get me a tactical vest and a fast car. At 2:15 a.m., the Seattle docks were veiled in a thick, freezing fog. The salty air was heavy with the smell of diesel and kelp. At the far end of Pier 49, completely isolated from the commercial traffic, sat a massive, sleek luxury yacht. Heavily armed men patrolled the gangway, watching nervously as executives hauled heavy metal server racks out of a nondescript warehouse and toward the vessel. They were so focused on the water that they completely missed the shadows moving behind them. Dalls Callahan crouched behind a rusted shipping container, a suppressed submachine gun resting tightly against his tactical vest. He was flanked by 6 of Vanguard's elite private operators, heavily armed and waiting for his signal. Through his earpiece, he heard Vergie's voice. She had commandeered the port's security camera network from her laptop back at the hospital. Dalls, you have 3 hostiles on the gangway, 4 inside the warehouse loading the servers. Vergie's voice crackled, cool and precise. The executives are already on the deck. You have to stop them before they cast off. Copy that, Dalls whispered. He looked at the operators beside him. Non-lethal shots unless fired upon. We want them alive to testify. Move on my mark. Dalls raised a closed fist, counted to 3, and opened his hand. The strike was a masterpiece of precision and violence. Dalls breached the fog like a ghost. He took down the first hostile on the gangway with 2 rapid, suppressed shots of rubber kinetic rounds to the sternum, sending the man flying backward onto the steel deck, breathless and incapacitated. The Vanguard operators swarmed the warehouse. Shouts erupted, followed by the dull thwack, thwack, thwack of non-lethal suppression fire. Cast off! Cast off now! One of the corrupt board members screamed from the yacht's upper deck, scrambling in a panic as the ship's engines roared to life. The heavy mooring lines began to slip. Dalls sprinted up the gangway just as it began to retract. He launched himself over the gap, his boots slamming into the teakwood deck of the yacht. A massive mercenary stepped out from the ship's bridge, raising a shotgun. Without breaking stride, Dalls dropped to a slide on the slick deck, dodging the deafening blast that shattered the railing above his head. As he slid, he swept his heavy boot into the mercenary's kneecap, breaking it with a sickening crack. The man went down screaming. Dalls sprang to his feet, ripping the shotgun from the mercenary's grasp and tossing it over the side into the freezing, murky water of the Puget Sound. He kicked open the door to the bridge. The captain threw his hands in the air, backing away from the controls. The 3 corrupt board members were huddled in the corner, clutching briefcases, their faces pale with sheer terror. Dalls leveled his weapon, his chest heaving, his hazel eyes burning through the fog and the chaos. Cut the engines, Dalls ordered, his voice booming over the rumble of the yacht. Or I sink this boat right now. The captain scrambled to the console, ripping the keys from the ignition. The massive engines choked and died. The yacht drifted slowly, bumping gently against the rubber bumpers of the pier. Through the earpiece, Dalls heard Vergie exhale a long, shuddering breath. The police and Coast Guard are 2 minutes out, Dalls. It's over. You have them. Dalls lowered his weapon, standing guard over the terrified executives. He looked out at the Seattle skyline, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. The shadow war was over. Hastings' network was completely dismantled, their stolen billions secured on the dock, their assassins neutralized. For the first time in 3 years, Dalls felt the crushing weight of the world completely lift off his shoulders. He keyed his radio. I'm coming back to the hospital, Vergie. Keep the coffee warm. 6 months later. The spring sun shone brightly over the manicured lawns of the Phillips estate, a sprawling, modern compound overlooking Lake Washington. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and fresh rain. Dalls Callahan stood on the sweeping limestone patio, wearing a perfectly fitted casual linen suit. He held a cup of artisan coffee, watching a scene unfold on the grass below that still felt like a dream. Lily, now 7 years old, was sprinting across the lawn, chasing a golden retriever puppy. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. There were no monitors. There were no oxygen tanks. There was just a little girl living a life she had been completely denied since birth. "She's getting faster," a smooth voice said from behind him. Dalls turned to see Vergie stepping onto the patio. She was dressed in a flowing silk dress, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. Over the past 6 months, she had transformed Vanguard Holdings from a corrupt corporate monopoly into a transparent, thriving empire. She was hailed by the media as a visionary, but to Dalls, she was just Vergie. "I can barely keep up with her anymore," Dalls smiled, stepping aside to let Vergie stand next to him at the railing. "Dr. Harrison said her heart is functioning at 100% capacity. She's completely cleared." Vergie leaned against the railing, their shoulders brushing gently. "I'm glad. She deserves it. You both do." Dalls looked at the woman who had saved his life. His role at Vanguard had expanded far beyond just protecting her physical safety. As the director of executive protection, he had built a state-of-the-art security apparatus, rooting out corruption at every level. He sat in on board meetings, his sharp military instincts proving invaluable in corporate negotiations. He was her most trusted advisor, her shield, and her closest confidant. "You know, I received a notification this morning," Vergie murmured, staring out at the lake. "The federal prosecutors finalized the plea deals. Hastings and the Shadow Board are officially serving consecutive life sentences in federal supermax. There will be no appeals." Dalls nodded slowly. "Then we finally have peace." "We do," Vergie said, finally turning her piercing gray eyes toward him. The professional boundary that had always hovered between them, thin as glass, seemed to shimmer and dissolve in the warm spring air. "Though I have a confession to make." Dalls. "Oh?" Dalls arched an eyebrow. "Is the CEO of Vanguard Holdings holding back critical intelligence from her head of security?" Vergie smiled softly, a genuine, vulnerable expression that she reserved exclusively for him. "When I was sitting in that alleyway, freezing, waiting for my security audit to end, I was utterly disillusioned with the world. I thought everyone was out for themselves. I thought humanity had simply traded its soul for money. And then, a minimum wage guard risked his entire livelihood to give a homeless stranger a cold egg sandwich and his only coat." She stepped closer, placing her hand gently over his on the limestone railing. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You didn't just save my life that night, Dalls," she whispered, looking up into his eyes. "You saved my faith in people. You reminded me what a good man actually looks like." Dalls's heart hammered a rhythm that had nothing to do with combat or adrenaline. He looked down at her, seeing past the billionaire, past the CEO, straight to the fierce, brilliant woman who had sat with him in a pediatric ward all night just to make sure he didn't fall apart. "And you," Dalls replied, his voice thick with emotion, "took a broken man who was ready to give up and gave him the power to protect his family. You gave Lily her future. I told you once that I would spend the rest of my life repaying that debt." "I told you there is no debt," Vergie said softly, stepping into his space, her eyes fluttering shut as she tilted her head up. "Then I'll just spend the rest of my life with you because I want to," Dalls murmured. He leaned down, and their lips met. The kiss was slow, deep and filled with the unspoken promises of the past 6 months, a silent vow of loyalty, protection, and profound love. When they finally parted, Vergie rested her forehead against his chest, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips. Down on the lawn, Lily threw a tennis ball for the puppy, her laughter echoing in the bright morning air. Dalls wrapped his arms around Vergie, pulling her close as they watched the sunrise reflect off the lake. He thought back to that freezing, miserable night in the alleyway. He had expected to lose everything. He had expected to be broken by the harsh reality of a cruel city. Instead, he had stood his ground. He had chosen compassion over fear. And by morning, the homeless woman he had protected had not only become his boss, but she had become his family, his future, and the greatest plot twist of his life. What an incredible reminder that true character is revealed not when we are being watched by the powerful, but in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Dalls risked everything he had to help a stranger in the dark, and it changed his family's destiny forever. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that good deeds always come back around, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a miracle today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring real-life stories. See you in the next video.